All right, looks like we're good to go. It was a while of standing up there awkwardly, so that's exciting. Yeah, thanks everybody for coming out. I probably recognize a third of the faces in the room, so it's good to see real live people. It's been a minute. I flew in this morning, so this is like my first in-person interaction with a lot of people in a long time. And I feel like I owe everybody an explanation as to the title of this. The way this came about is the ASU+GSV team emailed me and said, what are you an expert in? And I was in one of those times when I was having a bit of a moment, and what started out as a sarcastic quip turned into eventually the title of what we're talking about today. And so I want to talk a little bit about Lambda School, which is the company that I co-founded, a little bit about how we got to where we are, what our journey has been like. I want to talk a little bit, ever so briefly, about the psychology that happens to you when you start something, and some stuff that I've been reading about recently that we'll go into a little bit. And then we'll finish up with some Q&A at the end, which they recommended that I don't do, but we're going to do it anyway because it'll be fun. So for the Q&A portion, we'll raise hands and stuff, and then I'll repeat what you say so that the people who are online, so that both of them can hear us. But my journey started a little bit unconventionally relative to most ed tech founders, relative to most Silicon Valley founders, kind of across the board. I was basically in college. I started college as a junior because I had enough AP credits and I spoke enough Russian that I got I had like a Russian minor without ever attending a class. And I was super, super bored. I knew I wanted to be in tech. I knew I wanted to do something a little more interesting than college. So I basically just dropped out of college. I had a two-door Honda Civic. I drove to Silicon Valley, and I figured if you want to be meaningful in Silicon Valley, you have to know how to code. So I slept in my car for 3 months while I taught myself how to code. I ended up getting a job, several jobs, was on that career path. And when I went back home, so I'm from a town, I was living in a small town in Utah with probably 4,000 people when the university is in, a couple thousand people when the university is out. So it's a little college-ish, community college-ish town. And I would always be, surrounded by people. And I remember one time at a barbecue, one of my wife's friends came up and said, "Hey, I know that you work in Silicon Valley. I know you taught yourself how to code. Can you take me through step by step exactly what you did? Because I'm going to do the exact same thing." And I realized pretty quickly that that was not a good option for her or her little family or for really most people. So I started thinking about it was a life-changing experience for me, financially, of course, but being able to build and produce things felt like I had, magic powers that folks in small-town Utah didn't understand. It felt like I could go build whatever I wanted. It felt like I could go do whatever I wanted, and I didn't feel like that until I, was technical, until I knew how to code. And then I recognized that, if I'm talking to somebody who's making $30,000 a year, there isn't anything that I can recommend to them in good conscience. I can't say, take 4 years of your life and go to university and we're going to hope it works out. And I felt like there wasn't a really good online code school that I could recommend people go to. So the initial version of Lambda School was just, let's take the same 3-month code school that everybody else is running and let's put it online and we'll make it really cheap because we won't have offices. That initial vision was wrong for so many different reasons, but we got to, we were early stages. I was working with a co-founder. We were profitable. And the way we started gathering interest in Lambda School is we would teach free classes. And turns out if you teach free classes, all sorts of people join. So the very first time I had ever taught a class, I don't come from an academic background at all, the very first time I taught anything, there were 8,000 people in attendance. And I was winging it because I hadn't prepared anything, which is a theme. But from those 8,000 people, we started talking to them and saying, you should pay us $10,000 to go to our online code school for sure, first of all. And then everybody would say, yeah, I'm not going to do that. And we would say, well, why not? And basically everybody said, because I don't have $10,000, you idiot. That's why I'm trying to learn how to code so that I can increase my income. And we realized that a lot of America has the order backwards, right? Once I have a high-paying job, it's really easy to pay for something that's $10,000. But before then, if I'm going to take that out and take out a loan at that amount, not to mention, private, non-governmental loans at a 9% interest rate, like a $10,000 loan for somebody who's making $30,000 a year could be life-altering, could end them financially. So we tried a little experiment in the early days, and we said, all right, if there are a couple people that we've been talking to, and they literally just didn't have cash. And a couple of them were like, well, I'll go find a $10,000 credit card limit, and I'll put the whole thing on a credit card and hope it works out. And I was just like, please don't do that. I really think it will work out, but if it doesn't, you're going to be digging out of that for 15 years. And I realized what we were actually optimizing for was risk. And any student who's enrolling in a program is doing the calculus of how likely do I feel like how likely is the success of me attending this? And if it's high, I'm willing to spend more. If it's low, I'm willing to spend less. And then you run the calculus on what happens if I am successful. Usually the answer is, if you're successful, you're totally fine. You can pay off whatever loans you have, or no problem. But if you're not, and a lot of the lower income strata in society, the answer for if I'm not successful is I never get out of debt ever again in my life. And perhaps that's less true at a $10,000 code school, but the reason the $1.7 trillion in outstanding student loan debt exists is not because a lot of people are becoming doctors and making $500,000 a year and they have $200,000 in student loans. It's because if you look at the average school in the United States, if you look at the bottom 1,000 schools, universities in the United States, graduation rates look more like 25% than 75%. And of those that graduate, the people who obtain a job that is able to pay for the university that they just attended is even smaller. So you're pretty quickly getting to a point where somewhere between 10 and 20% of the people who attend a university are easily able to pay it off. And the other 80%, some it's not a big deal. And there's something like 20, 25, 30%, in some universities 50% or more, where statistically the student entering that school will end up worse off than if they had not attended. And so that really, I worked at a lending company before I started Lambda School, and so I was really used to thinking about risk and thinking about analyzing that and thinking about trade-offs and why do people take out a loan, when do they not, when do people take out a loan that they can't afford? Usually the answer is whenever somebody will give it to you. And the average person basically assumes that the broader financial industry is cognizant enough to take care of their well-being. And at least in the university system right now, that is fundamentally not true. And I definitely didn't want to replicate that within my school. And also, selfishly, I felt like if there a way you could reduce the risk for students so that you didn't have to put $10,000 on a credit card, which is something, even if there's a 95% likelihood of success, you should not do. If you're making, $20,000, $30,000 a year, how can the school hold some of that? And that's one of the things that drives me crazy is there are so many instances right now where if you watch a student who's about to enter into a student loan, The school knows that statistically that student will not ever be able to pay that student loan off. The government knows that statistically that student will not ever be able to pay the student loan off. The lender knows that statistically that student will not ever be able to pay the student loan off. But there's nobody in the loop that tells the student that ever. And that's crazy. And it's a fundamental misalignment of incentives, the way the university system works within the United States. So we started thinking, like, why does the school not hold any of that risk, right? Why does that all end up on the student? Why is there zero penalty for the school? You know, and I was used to working in lending institutions where if you make a loan and the money doesn't come back, that's on you, right? For a school, that's not true. The school can enroll a student, the money comes from somewhere else, and they don't have to care what happens on the other side. So we tried a little experiment, and we emailed our list of, we'd email this list of 10,000 people all the time, and when we'd email that list, we'd get a couple people to attend Lambda school and pay. And we said, let's try an experiment. It's just the two of us, a really small company, but we want to pick a couple people that you pay us $1,000 up front, and then if you get hired, you pay us back once you get the job. And pretty quickly we saw what was 1 or 2 applications when we sent out that email became 200 people who were interested. And I had been fortunate enough that I wrote a book that had some pretty solid earnings. And I said, we've got 6 months that we can live off of this book money if we want to. What would happen if we completely eliminated upfront tuition? What would happen if we bore all the risk as a school and we only got paid in the instance where we were successful? And that fundamental switch made us think very, very differently about how you build a school. It makes you think differently about admissions because now we're really underwriting people. We are trying to determine to the best of our ability, will this person be successful? Because now it's not an investment the student is making in the school, it's an investment that the school is making in the student. And then we say, is our training enough to get a student hired? Is this going to work? And if not, what do we need to do to adjust it? And we found that the average code school is something like 3 months long. And the reason that is because if you look at what you can charge up front, it usually caps out around $10,000, $15,000 before, it's really difficult to get a lot of people to pay $20,000 up front if they don't have a high-paying career. And so if you're limited to $10,000, $15,000 per student, you're basically limited to a 3-month class. And so every employer that I'm talking to is saying 3 months is too short, 3 months is too short, these students don't know what they need to know, but every school is locked in and unable to extend the length or to change the curriculum, or really you have 100 code schools running the exact same model. But if it's my money I'm putting at stake instead of the students, I'm going to make the education what it actually needs to be. So we immediately extended school to 6 months. We've been experimenting with 6 months to 9 months, really, really intense. Part-time has been a year to 18 months, which is a long time. And we said, let's figure out how to make it $0 up front, and you are only going to pay us back if you get a job that pays more than $50,000 a year or more. Turns out we sent out that email and 2,000 people applied from our 10,000 person list. And we have been on that journey ever since. We've raised $120 million in equity and much more in financing that model. We have students at about half of the Fortune 100. We see about 10 students get job offers per day right now. And it fundamentally shifted, I think, the way the code school industry works. If you look at the code school industry 10 years ago, and I use that term very broadly, it was basically a marketing game. And whoever has the best marketing enrolls the most students, and that's the way the money comes in, and you win. Now that's no longer the case. Now it is an outcomes game. Because the name of the game is who can offer the most to the student, who is willing and able to take upon themselves the most risk as a school, And you can only do that if your outcomes are strong. And so now everybody's competing to have the best outcomes so that they can offer the best financing option to students. I don't know if 10 years from now Lambda School will be wildly successful, but I am really, really glad that happened at a minimum. It's basically my life's work to make sure that continues to happen and scales. Whether it's Lambda School or somebody else, I think it will probably be Lambda School, but I don't care as much as that schools start to focus more on outcomes than marketing. And along the way, there were a whole lot, the topic of this is what I think you have to be able to do as someone who's starting something like that, or anything, in order to make that work. And a lot of my thinking comes from a book I recently read. Let me find the title of it, because I can never remember titles of anything. It's called A First-Rate Madness by Nasir Gamey. And basically, the thesis of the book is that leaders in time of crisis need to understand both mania and depression. And he uses some literal instances where historical leaders, whether it be JFK or Abraham Lincoln, legitimately suffered from what we would now consider bipolar disorder. But the strength that came from that is that you need the mania to understand what's possible, and you need the depression to understand what's real. And I think if there's one thing I've learned in starting a company that has seen crazy ups and downs, crazy highs and lows. I mean, we joke at Lambda School that if you don't cry at least once a week, you have lost your soul, because there's something that happens every week. A student who reaches out and says, "Oh my gosh, look, I got my daughter a bedroom for the first time," or a student that increases their income $60,000 a year. That happens half a dozen times a day at a minimum. And we're seeing income increases collectively in the hundreds of millions of dollars for all of our students per year. But the lows are also really low. And the difficult thing about running a school like Lambda School is, there's a student who told me once, if Lambda School fails, every single person that works at Lambda School will go on to work at another tech company or another school. Your lives will move along. It'll be a bummer for you guys, and your investors will lose money, but you won't be materially harmed. Your life won't be impacted in a significant, long-lasting way. But for me, as a student of Lambda School, if Lambda School fails, I have nothing. And if there isn't a Lambda School for the future generations of somebody like me, I don't know what I would do. So that is the mentality that a lot of students come into Lambda School having, is this is my shot at a better life. And if it works, it works. And if it doesn't, I'm stuck. And that weight is non-trivial. And it's really difficult knowing that any decision you make, my thought process all the time is, if I work another hour, will I help another 5 students get hired? And if I don't, will I not? If I hire this person, what will the trade-off be? And it's a little bit, I wanted, in the early days of Lambda School, I was really happy about how big the impact was. Now I honestly wish I could reduce it a little bit, because it's just so much all the time in any direction. And I think sometimes it's a founder's job, and it's the job of anybody who's starting something new, I think, to understand the mania, to understand the depression, and to be even-keeled throughout all of it. And that is not easy. And there are many instances of that, working in history and not working in history. I'm going to share one anecdote from, I was talking to one of my friends who's, I'm not going to name him because he didn't give me permission to share this. He'd be fine with it, but I would want to sanity check that before I do so. He was telling me about an individual who came into his office. This person's wildly successful, billionaire, whatever else, trying to sell his company. And this is how he described it. He came in to pitch us on buying his company in the summer of 1996, and it was the biggest disaster of a company I had ever seen. It was a total train wreck, and he was desperate to sell. It was a completely useless product with no adoption, coupled with a completely useless development environment, also with no adoption. And the founder was like a crazy uncle. He had a huge beard, he was completely out of step with the times. He'd actually been fired from his previous job. And then he went out and torched 10 years and hundreds of millions of dollars of investor money with nothing to show for it. And he asked me, do you think that's somebody you would be willing to bet on? Do you think that's somebody Silicon Valley would be willing to bet on? I was like, well, obviously not, based on that information. I was like, well, let me give you another clue as to who it was. It was about 95 degrees on the day that I met him, and he came into my office wearing a black turtleneck. There's only one individual in Silicon Valley who would wear a black turtleneck when it's 95 degrees. And I think it's, so obviously or maybe not obviously, the person I'm referring to is Steve Jobs. And he was trying to sell Next, which was his second company, which was completely failing, after he'd been fired from his first company, Apple. And Apple was not in a good spot, and Next was not in a good spot. And another anecdote, the same person said he went to a retreat with a bunch of VCs at the time, and they had like a breakout room thing where they were trying to come up with, what are the hardest questions in technology. And he proposed, how could Apple turn itself around? And he said, I remember distinctly, the leading tech analyst in the country at the time looked at me and said, we're supposed to come up with hard questions, not impossible questions. So it was not a foregone conclusion that Apple would be successful at all. In fact, this is perhaps less well known, or at least not as often talked about as I would like. When Jobs took over Apple in a weird, basically an acquisition for negative $400 million in a weird way, Apple had 90 days of cash in the bank, not much to show for it, and Steve was so nervous about being declared a failure that now the popular narrative is that he wanted to try out the CEO job, so he called himself interim CEO. The truth from folks that were there is he was pretty certain that the company was going to fail, so he didn't want to attach his name to Apple too closely. And 20 years later, that company was worth more than the entire German stock market. And I think we all understand where Apple is today. But I think that it's really easy to pinpoint something at a specific point in time, and I think that's one of the great things about technology in Silicon Valley. Is there so many times when you look at somebody's story or you look at a person and say, I am so glad I'm not that person, and then 5 years later they're wildly successful and they're a billionaire, and you're like, what happened? And a lot of the story of technology is finding something that has leverage and just compounding upon that. But it's not always easy. The path is not always certain. And oftentimes, I've talked to many founders who've started something successful, and there were times when they literally didn't see a path. And they just kept going because they didn't know what else to do, and there was no easy way to shut things down, so they just kept hoping to find something, and they did. And I think it's easy to forget those times. I think it's easy to underestimate those times. And it's difficult to understand what that's like. So I've made particular effort to reach out. You'll find that when, so Lambda School has gone through phases when I would get 1,000 emails a day from random people who are trying to invest, who are trying to work at the company. And it's gone through stages where the reverse has been true. It's gone through stages where nobody knows what's happening. And it's, I think the most important people within tech, within education, are the people who reach out when it's not clear that everything is working. The people who lend a hand when you are in that bottom phase. And going back to the Steve Jobs analogy, not a single investor invested in Apple for the 5 years, not a single traditional Silicon Valley venture capitalist, despite the dual class stock and everything they had going on, put any money in Apple for the first 5 years after Jobs took over. And that's supposed to be what they do. Find big bets that have a decent outcome, decent likelihood of return, and not a single investor in Silicon Valley did that. And it's rational, right? Everybody understands why. But I think my takeaway from the past few years is of living in Silicon Valley, of being in technology, is that the most important lesson for all of us is to not underestimate people. And I've seen a number of times, and that's perhaps one of the most magical things about working in technology, is I'll talk to a CEO and I'll think, yeah, the idea's a little weird, and then 4 years later, they're among the biggest companies in the world. And that's how quickly things can change. And I feel grateful to see that, to be a part of watching that, and to be in an environment where it is unwise to bet against people. If you could, people talk about income share agreements and the Lambda school model as investing in people. Somebody asked me once, could you build a model where it was possible to short people? Could you build a financial model where you could profit from somebody else's downfall? Morals aside, even if you could do that, I can't imagine a scenario where that would be wise, unless it was obviously fraudulent or something like that. But yeah. So a couple last things before we open it up to Q&A. First of all, some of you in this room have been that at times when Lambda School has been going through the rough patches. So you know who you are, and thank you for that. And I would encourage all of us to look around and find someone who's there, and reach out. And sometimes, when there's a giant article in a big publication that said Lambda School plagiarized its curriculum despite me showing them repeatedly that the other place plagiarized Lambda School's curriculum. They didn't care. They published it. The outpouring from people who understand that is really impactful. And that's it. With that, we'll turn over to Q&A for just a little bit. I know that was a little bit rambly. But yeah, just a thank you to those of you who are there in the difficult times. Yeah. Any general fundraising do's and don'ts from your journey on that so far? Yeah, so the question was, any general fundraising do's and don'ts? I think the best advice for fundraising is actually so simple that it's really difficult to follow. I think most really good advice is, if you ask somebody, how do you lose weight? And they tell you to eat fewer calories than you expend, it's both the most helpful advice and incredibly difficult to follow. So the only advice that I think really matters, because I've seen everybody break every other rule in the book, is have a business that people are willing to believe in. And I think so much is said about, in fundraising specifically, about tactics and what your pitch deck looks like and how you play these games with investors so that you get a bunch of them bidding against each other or whatever. At the end of the day, if you can, in good conscience and truly believing yourself, and I haven't invested a ton of money in startups, probably 5 or 6 million in all. But you can completely tell when a founder actually believes their own story and when they don't. And that's one of the main things that I look for. There are times when, and Chris Sacca has talked about this, his early fund was one of the most famous funds of all time, and it had somehow Twitter and Uber and Kickstarter and Pinterest, and just like statistically that should not be possible to do that. And when they asked him like what his key to success was, he said that he bets in the founders that are looking through him with confidence that they know where they're going and that they know exactly what they need to do to make that company work. That's really hard to do and to actually believe. And there have been times when I have understood and believed that for Lambda School, and there are times when it's harder for me to believe that. So the first step is having a business where the data supports the story that you're telling that is actually true. And then actually, like, I legitimately believe that actually believing that you will have a big, impactful company is the hardest part of fundraising. Everything else is tactics, and you can learn it from a blog post, and not that hard. Yeah.
You talked a lot about how the education system is broken, and obviously you're fixing it. But also, obviously, that it seems that you're a victim of the media system, like media reports. So what are you doing to find the media system, which is obviously also broken?
Not talking to reporters. I don't have a PR team inside Lambda School anymore, so I could say whatever I want, which wasn't true before. Just kidding. Yeah, I think, I don't want to get too deep into this, but I think there has actually been a shift in incentives in tech media specifically in the past 10 years. And there's been a broader perspective shift in, like if you look at articles from 2012, 2013, you cannot find anybody saying a negative thing about Uber. And contrast that to today. Uber had plenty of mistakes along the way, but there's something fundamental that shifted. I am a firm believer in incentives. I think the economics of both media and founders working with the media has fundamentally shifted. The average founder that I talk to now is trying to figure out how to not have to talk to the media. And I think it's that toxic, which is not ideal, but that's the place we're in right now, frankly. Yeah.
Well, on that note, a lot of us heard about you first through social media. Can you tell us about how you ended up being the social media persona?
Yeah. The first answer is accidentally. So for me, Twitter was, when Lambda School got into Y Combinator, I was like, okay, I need to stop tweeting because this is a really bad, unhealthy addiction for me, and I need to focus on building the company. And then about halfway through Y Combinator, I sent my first tweet, which was like, hey, actually, Lambda School, this is who we are, this is what we're doing. A lot of people who had followed me had no idea that you try to stay quiet for the first little while in Y Combinator to not get distracted. And then all of a sudden we had students, we had employees reaching out, we had hiring companies reaching out, and it quickly shifted from Twitter is an unhelpful addiction to, oh, actually Twitter is a meaningful piece of the company. And that's true today. Like I will get decks from our admissions team that's like, hey, you haven't tweeted about Lambda School in the past 17 days, and like we can see the dip. But outside of how it became strategic, my honest answer is like, I try to read interesting things and be surrounded by interesting people, and I tweet whatever is on the top of my mind and whatever I'm reading at any given time in hopes that it will be interesting to other people. And I think the main mistake that people make in social media is trying too hard to please everybody, and you end up pleasing no one. And I think, and you see, it's clear in the data that people respond to personalities, not brands necessarily. Like Elon Musk has probably 25 times the number of followers of Tesla. And I say that as like the most adamant Tesla fan of all time. Probably not of all time, but I freaking love my Tesla. And I was like, the one material thing that I wanted in this life was back then it was a Roadster, and then all of a sudden it was only $30,000. I was like, oh, this is way easier. but yeah, I think people can connect with you when you're being authentic, and that's the most difficult part of being on social media, is people misinterpreting and attacking you as you try to be authentic. And sometimes you say stuff that comes off wrong and you didn't mean it. And I think that's the most difficult part, is remaining true to who you are and being authentic. Yeah.
You talked about founder media, founder impression, and the really kind of riding away with that. And I was curious if we could speak a little bit about how you personally cultivate your judgment, especially when it comes to working with your co-founders, working with your team,
Yeah, so I mean, we've actually been talking about this with the executives at Lambda School recently. The question was, how do you cultivate judgment, despite or perhaps in response to kind of the highs and the lows? It's taken me a long time to kind of develop this mental model, but I think it's my job to understand the highs of where things could be. I think it's my job, to understand the lows. And for a while, I kind of had this mental model of I want to know the thing that's going to hurt me to know. I want to see that piece of data that's going to be oh my gosh, that's so broken. And now, I think you kind of develop an immunity to that, to where it's tell me the worst thing that's happening right now, and I'll see it with clear eyes. I think clear judgment is probably one of the most difficult things to cultivate, as if you don't have a ton of experience. Lambda School has been the biggest company I've ever worked at, right? And so it's kind of wild to be the CEO of that and have people with who have more experience than I have years of life helping you. But yeah, I think you just try. So there's a little bit of guess and check, and you try to see. You try to make predictions, write them down, and see what plays out and what doesn't. But I think the most important thing from a kind of psychosocial aspect is understanding what the highs are, understanding what the lows are, and then just being right in the middle when you're talking to the team. Because the team can tell when you're BS. If you're talking all about highs all the time, everybody's okay, yeah, we're always talking about this, but it's always fake. If you're talking about the lows all the time, everybody will get scared and quit. And so you have to be right in the middle. You have to be honest with everybody and recognize the trade-offs of both what's happening well and what's not. Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, with regard to income share agreements, other people are building, and I hope there will be millions of schools that build models similar to what Lambda School kind of popularized. What do you think about the trade-off between charging, we'll call it a deposit or some upfront tuition, and charging none? The short answer is that it's a trade-off. So an income share agreement, and it looks like we're running out of time, but an income share agreement puts all of the costs on the people who are successful. If you charge upfront, people have more skin in the game. They have to bet on themselves a little bit, which does change admissions. And it distributes some of the costs to people who, by definition, will not be successful. So they're different. It depends on the scale of the company and where you are. Lambda School has had deposits at some times. We've not had deposits. I imagine there will be a future where we have deposits again. It's really a trade-off of how much skin in the game do you need from the student, how much cash do you need to offset costs. There's not a good answer. It's just trade-offs. We've got 10 seconds. Anyone have a 2-second question? Yeah. So we're going to get cut off online. What thoughts do I have about mental hygiene? Short answer is try to, at the end of the day, you can experience whatever you want in the highs and the lows, and you have to bring yourself back to the middle. And I don't know there's a really good answer for exactly how to do that, but we're out of time. So thank you.